Section 27 of Manners, Customs, and Dress. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by HearHis.com. Manners, Custom, and Dress during the Middle Ages and during the Renaissance period by Paul Lacroix. Section 27. Punishments. Part 1. Refinements of penal cruelty. Tortures for different purposes, water, screwboards, and the rack. The executioner, female executioners, tortures, amende honorable, torture of fire, real and feigned, auto de fe, red-hot brazier or basin, beheading, quartering, wheel, garrote, hanging, the whip, the pillory, the arquebus, tickling, flaying, drowning, imprisonment, regulations of prisons, the iron cage, the Leads of Venice. It is very sad, says the learned M. de Virgile, to observe the infinite variety of tortures which have existed since the beginning of the world. It is, in fact, difficult to realize the amount of ingenuity exercised by men in inventing new tortures, in order to give themselves the satisfaction of seeing their fellow creatures agonizing in the most awful sufferings. In entering upon the subject of ancient modes of punishment, we must first speak of the torture which, according to the received phrase, might be either previous or preparatory. Previous, when it consisted of a torture which the condemned had to endure previous to capital punishment, and preparatory, when it was applied in order to elicit from the culprit an avowal of his crime, or of that of his accomplices. It was also called ordinary or extraordinary, according to the duration or violence with which it was inflicted. In some cases the torture lasted 5 or 6 consecutive hours. In others it rarely exceeded an hour. Hippolyte de Marcielle, the learned and venerable Jewish consult of Bologna, who lived at the beginning of the 15th century, mentions 14 ways of inflicting torture. The compression of the limbs by special instruments, or by ropes only, injection of water, vinegar, or oil into the body of the accused, application of hot pitch, and starvation were the processes most in use. Other means, which were more or less applied according to the fancy of the magistrate and the tormentor or executioner, were remarkable for their singular atrocities. For instance, placing hot eggs under the armpits, inducing dice between the skin and flesh, tying lighted candles to the fingers so that they might be consumed simultaneously with the wax, letting water trickle drop by drop from a great height on the stomach, and also the custom, which was, according to writers on criminal matters, an indescribable torture, of watering the feet with salt water and allowing goats to lick them. However, every country had special customs as to the manner of applying torture. In France, too, the torture varied according to the provinces, or rather according to the parliaments. For instance, in Brittany, the culprit, tied in an iron chair, was gradually brought near a blazing furnace. In Normandy, one thumb was squeezed in a screw in the ordinary, and both thumbs in the extraordinary torture. At Autun, after high boots made of spongy leather had been placed on the culprit's feet, he was tied onto a table near a large fire, and a quantity of boiling water was poured on the boots, which penetrated the leather, ate away the flesh, and even dissolved the bones of the victim. At Orleans, for the ordinary torture, the accused was stripped half naked, and his hands were tightly tied behind his back, with a ring fixed between them. Then, by means of a rope fastened to this ring, they raised the poor man, who had a weight of 180 pounds attached to his feet, a certain height from the ground. For the extraordinary torture, which then took the name of estrapade, they raised the victim, with 250 pounds attached to his feet, to the ceiling by means of a capstan. He was then allowed to fall several times successively by jerks to the level of the ground, by which means his arms and legs were completely dislocated. At Avignon, the ordinary torture consisted in hanging the accused by the wrists with a heavy iron ball at each foot. For the extraordinary torture, which was then much in use in Italy under the name Vigilia, the body was stretched horizontally by means of ropes passing through rings riveted into the wall and attached to the four limbs, the only support given to the culprit being the point of a stake cut in a diamond shape, which just touched the end of the backbone. A doctor and a surgeon were always present, feeling the pulse at the temples of the patient, so as to be able to judge the moment when he could not any longer bear the pain. At that moment he was untied, hot formations were used to revive him, restoratives were administered, and as soon as he had recovered a little strength, he was again put to the torture, which went on thus for 6 consecutive hours. In Paris, for a long time, the water torture was in use. This was the most easily borne and the least dangerous. A person undergoing it was tied to a board which was supported horizontally on 2 trestles. By means of a horn acting as a funnel, and whilst his nose was being pinched so as to force him to swallow, they slowly poured 4 contumars, about 9 pints of water, into his mouth. This was the ordinary torture. For the extraordinary, double that quantity was poured in. When the torture was ended, the victim was untied, quote, and taken to be warmed in the kitchen, end quote, says the old text. At a later period, the brodequins were preferred. For this torture, the victim was placed in a sitting position on a massive bench, with strong, narrow boards fixed inside and outside of each leg, which were tightly bound together with strong rope. Wedges were then driven in between the center boards with a mallet, 4 wedges in the ordinary and 8 in the extraordinary torture. Not unfrequently, during the latter operation, the bones of the legs were literally burst. The brodequins, which were often used for ordinary torture, were stockings of parchment, into which it was easy enough to get the feet when it was wet, but which, on being held near the fire, shrunk so considerably that it caused insufferable agony to the wearer. Whatever manner of torture was applied, the accused, before undergoing it, was forced to remain 8 or 10 hours without eating. Damhoret, in his famous technical work called Pratique et Inchiridion des Causes Criminelles, 1544, also recommends that the hair should be carefully shaved from the bodies of persons about to undergo examination by torture, for fear of their concealing some countercharm which would render them insensible to bodily pain. The same author also recommends, as a rule, when there are several persons, quote, to be placed on the rack, end quote, for the same deed, to begin with those from whom it would be most probable that confession would be first extorted. Thus, for instance, when a man and a woman were to suffer one after the other, he recommended that the woman be first tortured, as being the weaker of the two. When a father and son were concerned, the son should be tortured in presence of the father, quote, who naturally fears more for his son than for himself, end quote. We thereby see that the judges were adepts in their art of adding moral to physical tortures. The barbarous custom of punishment by torture was on several occasions condemned by the Church. As early as 866 we find from Pope Nicholas V's letter to the Bulgarians that their custom of torturing the accused was considered contrary to divine as well as to human law. For, says he, a confession should be voluntary, not forced, by means of the torture, an innocent man may suffer to the utmost without making any avowal, and, in such a case, what a crime for the judge! Or the person may be subdued by pain, and may acknowledge himself guilty, although he be not so, which throws an equally great sin upon the judge." After having endured the previous torture, the different phases of which were carried out by special tormentors or executioners, the condemned was at last handed over to the maistre des hauses ouvriers, that is to say, the executioner, whose special mission was that of sending culprits to another world. The executioner did not hold the same position in all countries, for whereas in France, Italy, and Spain a certain amount of odium was attached to this terrible craft, in Germany, on the contrary, successfully carrying out a certain number of capital sentences was rewarded by titles and the privileges of nobility. At Reutlingen, in Suabia, the last of the councillors admitted into the tribunal had to carry out the sentence with his own hand. In Franconia this painful duty fell upon the councillor who had last taken a wife. In France, the executioner, otherwise called the king's sworn tormentor, was the lowest of the officers of justice. His letters of appointment, which he received from the king, had nevertheless to be registered in Parliament, but, after having put the seal on them, it is said that the chancellor threw them under the table in token of contempt. The executioner was generally forbidden to live within the precincts of the city, unless it was on the grounds where the pillory was situated, and in some cases, so that he might not be mistaken amongst the people, he was forced to wear a particular coat, either of red or yellow. On the other hand, his duties ensured him certain privileges. In Paris he possessed the right of havage, which consisted in taking all that he could hold in his hand from every load of grain which was brought into market. However, in order that the grain might be preserved from ignominious contact, he levied his tax with a wooden spoon. He enjoyed many similar rights over most articles of consumption, independently of benefiting by several taxes or fines, such as the toll on the pied-pont, the tax on foreign traders, on boats arriving with fish, on dealers in herrings, watercress, etc., and the fine of 5 sous, which was levied on stray pigs, see previous chapter, and etc. And lastly, besides the personal property of the condemned, he received the rents from the shops and stalls surrounding the pillory, in which the retail fish trade was carried on. It appears that, in consequence of the receipts from these various duties forming a considerable source of revenue, the prestige of wealth by degrees dissipated the unfavorable impressions traditionally attached to the duties of the executioner. At least, we have authority for supposing this when, for instance, in 1418, we see the Paris executioner, who was then captain of the bourgeoisie militia, coming in that capacity to touch the hand of the Duke of Burgundy, on the occasion of his solemn entry into Paris with Queen Isabel of Bavaria. We may add that popular belief generally ascribed to the executioner a certain practical knowledge of medicine, which was supposed inherent in the possession itself, and the acquaintance with certain methods of cure unknown to doctors was attributed to him. People went to buy from him the fat of culprits who had been hung, which was supposed to be a marvelous panacea. We may also remark that, in our day, the proficiency of the executioner in setting dislocated limbs is still proverbial in many countries. More than once during the 13th century the duties of the executioner were performed by women, but only in those cases in which their own sex was concerned. For it is expressly stated in an order of St. Louis that persons convicted of blasphemy shall be beaten with birch rods, the men by men, and the women by women only, without the presence of men. This, however, was not long tolerated, for we know that a period soon arrived when women were exempted from a duty so little adapted to their physical weakness and moral sensitivities. The learned writer on criminal cases, José d'Amaraude, whom we have already mentioned, and whom we shall take as our special guide in the enumeration of the various tortures, specifies 13 ways in which the executioner, quote, carries out his executions, end quote, and places them in the following order: fire, the sword, mechanical force, quartering, the wheel, the fork, the gibbet, drawing, spiking, cutting off the ears, dismembering, flogging or beating, and the pillory. But before entering upon the details of this revolting subject, we must state that, whatever punishment was inflicted upon a culprit, it was very rare that its execution had been preceded by the amende honorable, which, in certain cases, constituted a distinct punishment, but which generally was but the prelude to the torture itself. The amende honorable, which was called simple or short, took place without the assistance of the executioner in the council chamber, where the condemned, bareheaded and kneeling, had to state that, quote, he had falsely said or done something against the authority of the king or the honor of some person, end quote. For the amende honorable in figure, that is to say, in public, the condemned in his shirt, barefooted, the rope around his neck, followed by the executioner, and holding in his hand a wax taper, with a weight which was definitely specified in the sentence which had been passed upon him, but which was generally of 2 or 4 pounds, prostrated himself at the door of a church, where in a loud voice he had to confess his sin, and to beg the pardon of God and man. When a criminal had been condemned to be burnt, a stake was erected on the spot specially designed for the execution, and round it a pile was prepared, composed of alternate layers of straw and wood, and rising to about the height of a man. Care was taken to leave a free space round the stake for the victim, and also a passage by which to lead him to it. Having been stripped of his clothes, and dressed in a shirt smeared with sulphur, he had to walk to the center of the pile through a narrow opening, and was then tightly bound to the stake with ropes and chains. After this, faggots and straw were thrown into the empty space through which he had passed to the stake, until he was entirely covered by them. The pile was then fired on all sides at once. Sometimes the sentence was that the culprit should only be delivered to the flames after having been previously strangled. In this case, the dead corpse was then immediately placed where the victim would otherwise have been placed alive, and the punishment lost much of its horror. It often happened that the executioner, in order to shorten the sufferings of the condemned, whilst he prepared the pile, placed a large and pointed iron bar amongst the faggots and opposite the stake, breast high, so that, directly the fire was lighted, the bar was quickly pushed against the victim, giving a mortal blow to the unfortunate wretch, who would otherwise have been slowly devoured by the flames. If, according to the wording of the sentence, the ashes of the criminal were to be scattered to the winds, as soon as it was possible to approach the center of the burning pile, a few ashes were taken in a shovel and sprinkled in the air. They were not satisfied with burning the living. They also delivered to the flames the bodies of those who had died a natural death before their execution could be carried out, as if an anticipated death should not be allowed to save them from the punishment which they had deserved. It also happened in certain cases, where a person's guilt was only proved after his decease, that his body was disinterred and carried to the stake to be burnt. The punishment by fire was always inflicted in case of heresy or blasphemy. The Spanish Inquisition made such a constant and cruel use of it that the expression auto de fe, act of faith, strangely perverted from its original meaning, was the only one employed to denote the punishment itself. In France, in the beginning of the 14th century, 59 Templars were burned at the same time for the crimes of heresy and witchcraft. And 3 years later, on the 18th of March, 1314, Jacques Molay and a few other dignitaries of the Order of the Templars also perished in the flames at the extremity of the island of Notre Dame, on the very spot where the equestrian statue of Henry IV now stands. Everyone is acquainted with the fact that judges were found iniquitous enough to condemn Joan of Arc to death by fire as a witch and a heretic. Her execution, which took place in the marketplace of Rouen, is remarkable from a circumstance which is little known, and which had never taken place on any other occasion. When it was supposed that the fire which surrounded the young heroine on all sides had reached her, and no doubt suffocated her, although sufficient time had not elapsed for it to consume her body, a part of the blazing wood was withdrawn, "in order to remove any doubts from the people," and when the crowd had satisfied themselves by seeing her in the middle of the pile, "chained to a post and quite dead, the executioner replaced the fire." It should be stated in reference to this point that Joan having been accused of witchcraft, there was a general belief among the people that the flames would be harmless to her, and that she would be seen emerging from her pile unscathed. The sentence of punishment by fire did not absolutely imply death at the stake, for there was a punishment of this description which was specially reserved for base coiners, and which consisted in hurling the criminals into a cauldron of scalding water or oil. We must include in the category of punishment by fire certain penalties, which were, so to speak, but the preliminaries of a more severe punishment, such as the sulphur fire, in which the hands of the parricides, or the criminals accused of high treason, were burned. We must also add various punishments which, if they did not involve death, were none the less cruel, such as the red-hot brazier, brazen ardent, which was passed backwards and forwards before the eyes of the culprit until they were destroyed by the scorching heat, and the process of branding various marks on the flesh as an ineffaceable stigma, the use of which has been continued to the present day. End of section 27. Recorded by hearhis.com.